Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we are here to talk about Glass, the third and possibly final movie in M. Night Shyamalan's very long gestating superhero-y trilogy consisting of Unbreakable and Split. And then, once we've done that, we'll be asking which other films from 10 to 20 years ago also need sequels. But before we start really franchising your favourites to death, Alistair, what else have you been consuming in the last fortnight?
I went to see new film Stan and Ollie.
Okay.
Yeah, which people probably heard about. It's been getting a fair amount of buzz and some good reviews. It's a biopic about Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, starring Steve Coogan as Stan Laurel and John C. Reilly as Oliver Hardy. About the black and white era comedy duo who were megastars in their day. They've interestingly set the film right at the end of their career when they're, sort of certainly past their peak and made a few commercial and critical decisions in their career and creative decisions that have brought them to a low point. And they're doing a tour of sort of small comedy venues in the UK trying to revitalise their brand. Yeah, and it's interesting, it's funny, it's quite moving. I had a sort of tear in my eye at one point. It's not a sort of knock it out of the ballpark brilliant. It hasn't got many Oscar nominations, and I don't see it really cleaning up. And I don't think it was as good as, say, The Favourite. But it was an enjoyable film, kind of sad and funny, so I'd recommend it.
Yeah, when I first saw the trailers for this, I did think, is that going to be some high-level Oscar bait? Because obviously, as we said before, it's a vaguely bittersweet biopic. It's about Hollywood stars. But yeah, when it actually came out, the talk seemed to go a bit quiet, which normally suggested that people went and saw it and it was, it's just okay. Fair enough.
I think it just lacks that kind of sparkle of brilliance to make it stand out. Or as we've sometimes said in previous reviews, it didn't transcend. But it was entertaining. It was funny. I thought Steve Coogan did an excellent performance as Stan Laurel. It was very, very good. Both the dramatic scenes, and obviously Steve Coogan's very funny. He's really good at the little things that Laurel and Hardy did. I mean, there's just the way they would get their hats confused, or there's a great sketch they do when they're both waiting for a train at a station. This is what the sketch they do in their live shows, and they're kind of looking for each other but constantly missing each other by going in and out of the waiting room at the right time to just miss each other. No, it's absolutely hilarious because it's just done those subtle, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's just very slight and very clever kind of little bits of physical comedy that Laurel and Hardy were really good at. And I think Steve Coogan certainly is very good at that kind of subtle comedic performances, just in the way that every little thing that Alan Partridge does is quite funny. Just even the way he potters around his static home is just hilarious. That kind of small comic movements and mannerisms that Steve Coogan's really good at so that was good.
Yeah, it's interesting to see Steve Coogan doing something other than Alan Partridge, I guess, in that he seems to be forever slightly struggling to get away from that, and maybe it won't be as big a success as he hoped if it's not gonna rain Oscar glory down upon him, but still, most people who've seen it seem to at least like it enough.
Yeah, I think Alan Partridge casts a very long shadow across his career, like a lot of comedians that have one breakout character that's incredibly funny, Al Murray and the pub landlord, even Sacha Baron Cohen, really, it's just Ali G and Borat, and to a lesser extent Bruno. He doesn't have a huge range of characters. But, he's tried different things, Coogan. He's in that absolutely excellent film, 24-Hour Party People, a biopic of Tony Wilson. But Tony Wilson is basically Alan Partridge if Alan Partridge was into sex, drugs and rock and roll. So it's not a huge stretch. He's done a few other comedic films, including playing himself in The Cock and Bull Story. But every time you can see he's kind of just doing sort of Alan Partridge, even doing kind of Alan Partridge as himself. So this is actually him doing something very different.
I was going to say, this is something other than Alan Partridge then.
No, this is actually, a whole different character and a different approach to comedy. It is a different performance. So it does show that Steve Coogan does have range. It's just that there's this one character that's very popular. But I think there's some of the comedic skills that Coogan has that made Alan Partridge such a success. I can see them working here. The kind of, like I say, subtle physical comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd recommend that if you've seen all the Oscar films and looking for more stuff. Anyway, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, in a vague continuation of my non-fiction reading strands, although it is kind of a book about fiction, I've been reading the book Super Gods by Grant Morrison, which is a book by the successful comic writer Grant Morrison about the history of the superhero, and I think it's basically going to be his attempt to explain why they seem to have chimed so amazingly with, the current world and become such a dominant force in pop culture. Admittedly, I haven't reached that bit yet. I'm about just over halfway through and I'm still somewhere in the late 90s. But it's interesting so far. To be honest, it's kind of almost more interesting when he's talking about the historical stuff and his feelings on other people's work than when he's actually talking about his own life, when he does kind of sometimes get into mythologizing himself in a slightly 90s indie band member kind of way. Like some of his discussion about how he was a good-looking lad in skinny jeans doing constant drugs. To be honest, they remind me of nothing more than when I read Alex James's autobiography a few years ago, because I like Blur. And Alex James's book, A Bit of a Blur, is very charmingly written, but it's basically just a long description of all the parties he went to in London in the 90s and all the drugs he took while he was at them.
Yeah, well, if you're writing your own book, I guess where else can you mythologize yourself other than in your own book? But it does sound, I don't know, possibly could get a little tedious.
He intersperses it reasonably well with, the historical stuff and the actual let's talk about the culture stuff with, and then I went and did a load of acid. And in many ways, I myself was a bit like a superhero as I did my acid. I mean, okay. I don't know if he's going to tie that into the wider culture or not. Like, obviously, a lot of people like superheroes, and not all of those people do acid. But I'm excited to find out.
It's an interesting crossover in that Venn diagram.
I mean, to be fair, I've read a lot of Grant Morrison's work. He's definitely done a lot of acid.
Fair enough. I would be very interested to hear his thesis on why comic book films are so successful now, because obviously they've been around for a long time. They did Superman films in the 70s and there was the Tim Burton Batman films, but the fact that they've really broken through now and seem to be so dominant for such a long period of time, over 20 years since Blade came out, nearly 20 years since X-Men came out, so there's clearly more at work here than just superheroes are popular or studios are risk adverse and are drawing on popular characters, because the Zoodles are popular characters from TV sitcoms to classic novels, but superheroes are the thing they do. So I'd be interested to see, especially as like a comics industry insider, what his explanation for this is.
He's one of the sort of British writers who semi-invaded American comics in like the 80s and early 90s. Similar vintage to the Neil Gaiman's, Garth Ennis's and Warren Ellis's and, who's the other one? So Alan Moore, obviously, of this world. Although, he's possibly the one who actually likes superheroes the most. Most of those other writers, you always get the feeling they're kind of writing superheroes with their teeth gritted because, it's the mainstream genre in the industry and they need to do it for the money and to get their names out there. But Grant Morrison seems to actually love them, which does mean this book isn't quite as much of a bitter slog as it would have been if, say, Alan Moore had written it.
Yeah, I think Alan Moore is the go-to guy. You can tell doesn't really like superheroes, or certainly doesn't now.
No, well, pretty much all his big signature works in the area are on why superheroes are basically a silly power fantasy and a part of this desire to be subjugated, or this weird, desperate admiration towards big, muscly people who will just take us over and dominate us, and really how if we actually had superheroes, they would go mental and then kill us all. There's a lot of that in Alan Moore's work, whereas Grant Morrison seems to sometimes entertain the notion, but a world that had superheroes in it might not be a dystopia.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. His book so far, I'll let you know when I get to his amazing thesis. I mean, I'm curious whether it's going to be some brilliant cultural hypothesis, or if it's just going to be something weird about the gods he sees while he's on acid and how he thinks superheroes resemble them. There has been hints of that.
Is he trying to tie sort of our obsession with superheroes into like mythology and things like that? I've seen people try to do that. They're like, I don't know, Spider-Man is just the modern day Hercules or whatever.
I mean, the book's called Super Gods, so I think so. He sort of starts there because obviously, like a lot of the original superheroes are borrowed a bit from myths and stuff. But yeah, how he's going to get back to that in a modern context, I don't know. I'll let you know when I get there.
Sounds good, yeah. But it does sound like a good book.
It is very well written. He definitely has a turn of phrase, Grant Morrison. I'm enjoying it.
First up this episode, we will be reviewing Glass. Directed by M. Night Shyamalan, it is the sequel to Unbreakable and Split. This film stars Bruce Willis, Samuel Jackson, and James McAvoy as a group of real-life superheroes and supervillains who end up incarcerated in an institution where it had attempted to convince them that superheroes are not real and this could all be a coincidence, but it could also all not be a coincidence. We went to see this film recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
So, on the one hand, I enjoyed this film for the most part while I was watching it. It's probably a bit longer than it needs to be, but I wasn't bored. I think it's nicely shot. I think it keeps the tension going quite well. All three of the leads are quite, obviously quite big, charismatic actors. McAvoy, Jackson and Willis, which probably helps. And it's kind of fun to watch them just sort of bounce off each other. I'm not sure it's actually good, like, especially if you try and divulge what it's actually saying. I think you may well come away with the suspicious feeling that it's largely bollocks. But on the other hand, I did kind of enjoy it when I was watching it. I think maybe it just reminds me of some of the slightly pretentious pseudo-adult superhero comics I used to read as a teenager. And much like those, I think it really wants me to think it's trying to say something really deep about the wider world, or Batman, or the wider world through the medium of Batman. I'm not sure it actually is, though. But the general atmosphere of it I still found quite entertaining.
Yeah, I certainly wasn't bored, and this film isn't terrible, this is more damning with faint praise. And considering some M. Night Shyamalan films that I have sat through are really, really bad, like The Last Airbender and After Earth are some of the worst movies I've ever seen. So it's not a real stinker. I mean, on the whole, I didn't like it really when I saw it, but, it had some good things. Like, I thought Samuel Jackson and James McAvoy both did very good performances. James McAvoy especially playing his character from Split, who's a character with DPD, dissociated personality disorder, so he switches between lots of different personalities, and he does a very good job of playing this range of characters really well, like including one who's like a 9-year-old and really does play like 9 quite well, and plays like some of the characters are men and women, and it's a really broad range of performances for one film, so that's very good. My main problem with this film is that I didn't really care about the characters or story, which is there's something of a problem. Like, it did do something quite interesting for a bit when there's the whole superheroes aren't real, this is all a delusion. But then the revelation at the end, spoilers again, if you want to see this film after we've sort of damned it with faint praise.
Yeah.
The revelation at the end is that superheroes are real, so they kind of pull that back, and I just didn't feel anything, for the characters or story.
I mean, the storyline they're doing in this film, which has been done before in quite a lot of genre shows, is the one where the main character or characters are locked in an asylum while someone, basically the baddie, tries to convince them that they've been imagining their superhero life and they're actually insane. And it's a difficult one to pull off because, obviously, especially when it's like an episode of a TV show, you're sort of sitting there going, well, it obviously is real because I've watched 10 million episodes about how it is real, and there'll be another one next week. So you better do some amazing characterization and dialogue here, because the premise is obviously kind of lacking in drama.
Yeah.
And some people pull it off. There's a quite good episode of Buffy that does this. Conversely, Iron Fist, the famous superhero punching bag of our times, did this plot in its second episode, and it was really stupid.
Yeah.
So I'm just waiting for the stories to get going, and this is clearly just treading water. Anyway, as ever, not reviewing Iron Fist. In some ways, it's a weird choice of story. I quite liked the twists at the end, I must admit. I thought, I know M. Night Shyamalan is quite famous as the twist master, which served him quite well for a couple of films, and then I think kind of became a bit of a weary, sighing joke in later ones.
Yeah.
And I thought the twists here are quite good as twists go, but they actually recontextualised and improved the film without making me think, well, it was all pointless then. So I quite liked the twists here, but the actual plot, especially because, as I say, I think it's a bit longer than it really needs to be, does risk slightly undercutting the drama.
Yeah. The last few minutes, I agree with you that I assume what you mean by literally the last kind of 5-10 minutes of the film.
Yeah.
When they're revealing to the world the existence of superheroes. That I thought worked quite well, and it was a good note to end on. What I sort of didn't like is where kind of I felt the plot didn't do anything for me, was the sort of revelation that there's a shadowy conspiracy that is kind of behind this asylum that's here to convince the world that superheroes aren't real and to keep superheroes in check. Again, that could have been a good twist. I'm sure it's been done in many comics and TV shows, but partly it was done in such a heavy-handed way. There was a bit just when the main character, or the main villain, the woman who's trying to deprogram the various superheroes and supervillains, pretty much talks straight to camera and just explains that there's a secret shadowy group who are here to keep superheroes in check. And their symbol is having a tattoo of a 3-leaf clover, so they can cleverly disguise themselves as Irish people, I guess, and not be detected. Yeah,
it was a pretty heavy-handed version of that cliche. It didn't really. I mean, to call it back to Grant Morrison yet again, Grant Morrison does quite a good conspiracy. The conspiracies generally turn out to be interdimensional bug people in people suits or something. And it makes it all seem a bit more interesting than when it's inevitably just people in suits and, boring soldiers with guns, which it kind of is in this film.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not only that the twist is just a bit boring, it's just the way it's handled when it's just sort of literally a character monologues to camera about it. And it's just done in such a sort of kind of slightly crap, heavy-handed way. There's so much terrible dialogue in this film. Like, Samuel L. Jackson, again, just kind of playing the character Mr. Glass from Unbreakable, someone who believes in superheroes and believes that comics and things like that are as an attempt to get in touch with, I don't know, like ancient mythos, as we said in the Grant Morrison section, or, superhuman beings, but just endless monologuing about the plot from, was it like, this is the point in a comic when this happens, and kind of just endlessly kind of explaining the plot of the film we're watching to the audience in a way that no human being ever would. It's just too much really bad, heavy-handed writing, kind of explaining the plot, and like, this is what's happening now. And it's like, I can see what's happening now from watching the film.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I seem to have accidentally hit on a big bit of synchronicity by talking about super gods just before we cover this. But yeah, again, calling back to what I was saying about the Grant Morrison book, the fact that he's waited nearly 20 years to do this, there's material in there, there's stuff he could have addressed with the Mr. Glass character about the fact that in the intervening 20 years, Mr. Glass has been kind of correct and superheroes have kind of taken over the culture,
Yeah.
Like, in Unbreakable, superheroes were played as this sort of underground mythology, known only to nerds and outsiders.
Yeah.
In 2019, they are the cultural standard known to basically everyone. And
yeah, they are pop culture.
I really felt that making this film now, particularly with that character who's meant to be, he's fully aware of this stuff and his name's in the title, I really thought they might actually look at that in some way, and they didn't at all. It's not mentioned, it's not a hint of that, which just feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity, really, and it was kind of what I was hoping they'd do with this film, and they just haven't.
No, exactly, yeah. They don't introspect about where pop culture's gone, but they do spend endless times introspecting about the plot of this own film and how it relates to a comic. Yeah, which is a missed opportunity, to say the least.
Yeah, I don't know if I found that more annoying just because, it's not, as I say, it's not specialist geek knowledge anymore, it's just general knowledge. But yeah, Mr. Glass making constant references to the idea that they're playing out a general comic plot. I suppose I sort of appreciate the vague misdirection of them setting up this epic showdown at a skyscraper and then just never actually getting there. There's something kind of funny about that.
Yeah, like where this fell down is, which I think is what we're getting at, is kind of actually where a lot of superhero, adaptations of comics that we've covered fall down, which is when they become too invested in the lore of the universe and not enough invested in the character or story. I mean, we've seen Batman, Superman, DC films come unstuck with this recently, so it's not just a problem that affects this film, Glass, although it's like, it's got 3 big stars in it and it's quite high profile. It's nothing compared to this year's big superhero films in terms of scope. So this is a problem that affects superhero films both big and small, if we're going to call Glass a small superhero film. But there is sometimes writers are like, we're more into like explaining this world and the history and the lore of these characters and this universe, rather than actually finding a competent story and then telling it effectively. So that is where I think this film kind of went down, which is like, there's some interesting things like, the Bruce Willis character's relationship with his dad. James McAvoy's character is quite interesting. Obviously, a complex character who's been abused a lot and has developed all these different personalities. Again, Mr. Glass is an interesting character. There's definitely potential here for a good story and some interesting characters. But the story just never really happens and we never really get enough of the characters. But what we do get is too much superhero lore and conspiracy theory lore.
Yeah, it's weird that considering this is meant to be the grounded superhero series or something, I think that's how people seem to be framing it.
Yeah,
as you say, we never really get under the character's skin that much. Like, I honestly feel I have a better handle, I feel more invested as characters in, Captain America, Iron Man or Star-Lord than I do most of the characters in this, because more time is taken to actually invest in them and, explore their feelings and what they want than most of these characters who largely just sort of stand around.
Yeah, I mean, that's why things like, like Guardians of the Galaxy or, the Captain America films are good films, even though on paper it's harder to relate to Star-Lord or Captain America than it is to these characters who are in essence real-life people inside this kind of fantastical situation. But, the writers and directors have taken time with the characters to be like, well, we need to find the relatable human emotions in them. We need to find the story that people can get invested in. We need to find ways to connect the characters. And we need to make sure that comes first. And then any universe complexities and universe details and backgrounds, and pasts of the character, all of that has to fit around it. It's kind of what supports the good story and the good character. Whereas when that stuff kind of takes over, you end up with a bad film, which is why Man of Steel, all the kind of Superman mythos kind of takes over, and the idea of Superman as this kind of icon completely replaces relatable character or engaging story. And, these ideas about real life superheroes is completely taken over, any idea of decent plotting or character.
Yeah, to be honest, the most relatable character is Bruce Willis as this sort of dude who works in security and is sort of this part-time superhero because he's discovered he has these powers. The best part of the film is probably the first 20-ish minutes, which is just about Bruce Willis being a relatable superhero.
Yeah.
Bruce Willis, to be honest, doesn't actually seem to be in the film that much beyond that first, half hour.
Yeah.
He's in it at the beginning and at the end. There's a long period in the middle where I think he only appears in about 2 or 3 scenes. I don't know whether that's a deliberate plotting decision or a Bruce Willis is too famous to be there for the whole shoot decision or whatever. But yeah, possibly one of the reasons why I did feel it drifted a bit free of reality is that, the big relatable character was probably Bruce Willis, and Bruce Willis just sort of vanished.
Yeah, the film starts out quite well. Yeah, it picks up exactly where Split left off. The character of the Horde, played by James McAvoy, is on the loose and kidnapping and killing people. He's kidnapped a group of cheerleaders. They're cheerleaders because he's kidnapped them all wearing their cheerleading costumes for some reason. And and Bruce Willis is just trying to do a bit of, grunt level detective superhero stuff of track these people down and save them, which is kind of like the kind of the dynamic of Split, but with a superhero thrown in. Split is very much sexy abduction, crazy person kidnaps teenage girls whose clothes slowly get torn off during the following escape attempts.
Split, which we also watched in the last 2 weeks as research for this, is trash, but it knows it's trash, and as a result it kind of works.
Yeah, and it does have the amazing performance by James McAvoy, which is his kind of redeeming feature. All that said, I think if they had done basically Split, but with a superhero thrown in, like the beginning of the film was, just James McAvoy is a sort of superhero serial killer, and this kind of decent superhero vigilante guy is trying to track him down and save, some innocent lives. That, as a story, could have worked. And I assume where they were going with it is that he has to team up with Mr. Glass because Mr. Glass is clever and is able to find the Horde. But that's kind of the first 20 minutes of the film, and then they all get arrested, put in an asylum, and it becomes this meta story about, heroes and, conspiracies and stuff, and it all kind of falls apart.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, I should probably loop back round now. I didn't hate it when I was watching it. The performances carry it. The individual scenes are kind of okay written, but it's not a film that stands up to analysis well, as this complete shoeing we're now giving it might tell you.
Yeah, like I say, it is entertaining to watch, and it's got some decent performances and some decent fight scenes in it, and a good ending. And it's not as much of a sort of heaping trash fire as After Earth or The Last Airbender.
Well, there's the vague narrative is M. Night Shyamalan is having a tiny bit of a renaissance with Split, and now this renaissance being he's no longer making incredibly bad films. Again, Split, although it's quite trashy, it's a competently made kidnapping thriller. It's not boring or stupid. Yeah. Well, it is quite stupid, but I think it's stupid in a way that doesn't feel pretentious. I think it's stupid in a sense that it seems to know it's stupid.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it works as a kidnap thriller, It's got Anna Taylor-Joy, who we saw in The Witch, who's also in Glass. For some reason, weirdly, attached to the man who kidnapped her and imprisoned her and nearly killed her. So that also sort of beggared belief a bit.
Yeah, I didn't entirely get that shift either. I don't think they entirely sold that. I just was forced to just sort of go with it in order for the movie to not fall apart. But I felt that was a bit of a weird shift.
Yeah.
Maybe they were counting on me not having seen Split for a couple of years, but having watched Split literally the day before I saw Glass, it seemed a bit of a jump to me.
The other thing that I thought was a bit of a time waste in this film and was kind of unnecessary is, so M. Night Shyamalan feels the need to cameo himself in all of his films, usually in a fairly rubbish way. He's not the best actor who ever graced the silver screen. And obviously he cameoed in Unbreakable and he cameoed in Split. And I was thinking is he going to cameo in Glass? And will they find a way to reconcile the two cameos to convince you that it is one character? And yes, he does. he does devote a proportion of the film, possibly 30 seconds, but still a proportion of the film, in order to, reconciling the continuity of his cameos in the previous two films. And I was thinking, I don't care about your main characters, mate. I definitely don't care about the continuity of your cameos. What are you doing?
Look, if Marvel can imply that all the Stan Lee cameos are the same person, then M. Night Shyamalan could establish his own cameos as being the same person. He's basically the Stan Lee of this universe.
Including when Stan Lee was Hugh Hefner, which makes less sense.
It's all part of one glorious whole. I think it was Guardians 2 that had implied that Stan Lee was one cosmic being travelling between all these films. Anyway.
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so Glass, yeah, if you really like pretentious 90s Vertigo comics, you might get a bit of a buzz off it, but I must admit, it's not great. It doesn't stand up to reviews, amazingly.
I don't know, a semi-interesting hot mess.
It's one of those interesting failures that we reviewers like to talk about. It's probably not actually good, but it does give you a lot of material for your podcast.
Next, we will be discussing what films from 10 to 20 years ago need a sequel. Unbreakable came out in 2000 and now has 2 sequels. In the last 19 years, as well as the rise of the superhero, which we discussed in the first half, the other big trend across Hollywood has been increasingly popular sequels to classic films. We've had sequels to Mad Max, Blade Runner, Predator, Halloween, others. So a sequel to anything may be possible. So in that vein, Nick, what sequels from a while ago would you like to see?
Well, I think it's obvious the only valid answer to this question is when will M. Night Shyamalan make The Seventh Sense?
Oh dear. Haley Joel Osment, does he still act?
I'm not sure. He wasn't the kid in episode 1 who was driven out of it by stalking, was he? That was someone else.
I believe that was a different kid. Although Star Wars Episode 1 did come out 20 years ago, so in 1999, so it was within the scope of this question, so we could do a direct sequel to The Phantom Menace is an eligible answer to this question.
Star Wars Episode 1.5.
Yes, the film really nobody wants to see, even probably hardcore Star Wars fans.
Anyway, yeah, long story short, Haley Joel Osment, not doing a huge amount, but probably have time to come back and star in
The Seventh Sense.
The Seventh Sense, if M. Night Shyamalan makes it, which he should not do.
Little do we know that The Seventh Sense is your sense of balance.
Bruce Willis was lying on the floor the whole time. I looked at a list of the greatest movies of the 2000s for this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm terrible at seeing films, so I haven't seen most of these. And obviously, the one 2000s film they're still in the middle of making a sequel to is Avatar, which ironically is one that definitely isn't needed.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've done my jokes. Have you got any that you think actually should be made?
So interesting that I had the same instinct to you, which is I went and looked at a list of the best films from the 2000s, the decade, the first decade of the current millennium.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing I found out is that it's really quite hard to find films from that period that were even moderately successful, or at least, people still remember, that a sequel could be done of them, that one hasn't been done for them.
Yeah.
So that's it. So, I looked along the list, and obviously there's a lot of the ones that don't have sequels that were good are films that you just really can't do sequels to, like American Beauty or The Pianist, because those films just so completely and utterly wrap up their story that there is almost no way you could do a sequel. So, yeah, there's been so many sequels to, things like The Incredibles or Jurassic Park. It is somewhat difficult to find things to do sequels to. Blade Runner, though Blade Runner came out in the 80s.
They did a sequel to Donnie Darko.
Yes.
Even though it's completely unnecessary. Even though that is one of those films I would think you can't do a sequel to. They still managed it.
Yeah, and that's probably should be a warning to anyone who's considering doing a sequel to American Beauty. Fun fact, that was my favourite film for quite a while. American Beauty. Did
it fall off the top of the list when all the grim revelations about Kevin Spacey came out, or had that happened before then?
No, I just sort of reassessed my list at some point. That's all. I've seen more films at that point. But looking down the list, there was a couple that did jump out, especially also if we broaden this to be 20 years, so that would include 1999.
Was 1999 a good year then?
1999 was a very good year. There was a sort of meme of articles being shared, usually around the new year, of that 1999 was a great year for film. Included such films as Fight Club, Matrix, American Beauty, Run Lola Run, The Sixth Sense, which you just mentioned, American Pie, Three Kings, Election, Being John Malkovich, Magnolia, Office Space. So there's some good stuff. So anyway, here's some things I thought would lend themselves to sequels. The obvious one is Fight Club, because there are other books you can adapt.
There is a Fight Club 2 comic.
Yeah. I think, but Chuck Palahniuk wrote quite a lot of novels, I think, set in the Fight Club universe. Election, the Matthew Broderick and Reese Witherspoon's film about the high school election. You could do a sequel to that, bringing the characters up to date, especially as Election ends, I believe, with the Reese Witherspoon character going to work for a Republican congressman. So Election, the Trump era, I think actually could be brilliant. Matthew Broderick still trying to bring down this obsessively pole climbing overachiever who's now, I guess, trying to become a rising Republican in the era of Trump. Children of Men, absolutely amazing film.
Considering how much Kevin Smith seems willing to milk his properties, I'm surprised there hasn't been a direct sequel to Dogma yet.
Oh yeah, that could work. I
mean, I don't know if Affleck and Damon would want to do it. They may feel they've moved on with their lives by now. But considering he's made sequels to Clarks and Mallrats, I think, surely that's next.
Yeah, I'm surprised actually he hasn't done that, because it's probably his best film. Although Clerks is good. 28 Days Later, every time he mentions sequels, I say I want more 28 Days Later films. I know there is a sequel, but I do want them to go back to that universe.
Considering how much they've milked almost every other franchise, I am pleasantly surprised we haven't had a Wall-E sequel, to be honest.
Yeah, the other ones that jumped out for me is, almost every Pixar film could have a sequel, which is why I guess we've got, Incredibles 2. So actually, Wall-E is an example, or Ratatouille. I'm sure you could do a sequel to Ratatouille.
But the thing is, most of the Pixar films they haven't already done sequels to are the ones where you immediately think, oh god, please don't do a sequel to that. Like Wall-E and Up, both of which don't really need sequels at all.
Well, Up, definitely they can't do a sequel.
So you'd really hope there's a reason they haven't done that, but I've learnt not to overestimate them. I can't believe we're getting Toy Story 4.
Yeah, they will continue to flog their horse forever. And because it's CGI, they literally can until the end of time.
I mean, the annoying thing is, I don't know why it's annoying, the thing is, Toy Story 3 was actually good, so there's a degree to which, if it's good, then it's good, but it's just every time they squeeze out another one, I feel like the odds of it being good go down a little bit.
The law of statistics means that they can't all be good.
Especially because number 3 did close off the story quite nicely, but anyway.
Yeah, that tends to be a problem as well, when something quite convincingly wraps up the plot. That's not a good point to carry on. Yeah, but Ratatouille, I know they could do a sequel to that, because you could have him, again, if there's something new you can do with a character, either some new place to take them or a new development that's happened since then that you'd be interested to see how that character responds to. Obviously Ratatouille is sort of set in the world of Parisian fine dining. Would it be interesting to see what if, Ratatouille moved to Portland and opened a street food truck selling burritos or whatever? There's been changes in the world of cuisine, casual dining, the honest burgers and whatever of this world. Would it be interesting to see how the character responded to that? Possibly not, but I guess if it's, as you say, if it's done well, it's done well.
I mean, I have not seen Ratatouille. It's one of the many thousands of films I haven't seen, so I don't actually know how they ended it. I assume the rat didn't die.
No. The rat does not die.
Okay. It seemed unlikely in the children's film that the rat would die, but you never know. I mean, Up's pretty grim.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for the Passion of the Christ sequel covering his ascension into heaven.
Oh dear. Because Mel Gibson needs more excuses to make anti-Semitic outbursts.
I mean, you can cover the whole apocalypse if you want to get a bit more blooded.
Yeah, I guess so. Passion of the Christ 2, Revelations. Maybe we should do the sequel as the Second Coming.
What, say it in the modern day?
Yeah. And Mel Gibson can both write, direct, and play Jesus.
I mean, retrospectively, it's hard to believe that isn't the whole reason he made the film.
Yeah, so there's that to look forward to. The trick to finding a good sequel is if there's more you can do with the characters, or if there's more plot, like Fight Club, obviously, there's more books. Again, Office Space, would it be interesting to update it to a modern workplace? I mean, the characters would be quite old, I guess, but yeah. Office Space has something to say about that kind of 90s commercial, about the work environment of the 90s. And I think the work environment of today is quite different. They try to make work fun with I have worked in places when you get Xboxes and table football and things, things like that, and the director bakes cakes. So could Mike Judge do an update of the classic office satire but set in the modern workplace? I mean, I think there's scope for something there.
Yeah, it's been a few years since both versions of The Office finished. Surely there's something new to say about offices at this point.
Yeah.
And of course, they never made any sequels to The Matrix, so we could give that a go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of blur in my mind of which I don't want to investigate too closely, so I'm pretty sure there's definitely scope for more to be done with the Matrix universe.
I suppose you could tack a third volume onto Kill Bill, although I gather Uma Thurman is parted company with Quentin Tarantino in a slightly unfriendly way, so she may not want to do that.
I did think that 2 Kill Bill films was too much. So it could have quite easily been chopped down to, I think, one much better film. And so, yeah, and with everything, especially with prima donna directors like Tarantino, who think they're geniuses, more indulgence is never the solution, usually less. So 2 Kill Bills was too much, so a third Kill Bill is definitely too much. But
I feel like there's a degree of too little too late in worrying about indulgence when we're trying to tack unnecessary sequels onto things.
that is a good point.
Of course, they have already ruined the Lord of the Rings trilogy with the Hobbit prequels, so we don't need to worry about them.
No, exactly. They've also done endless Blair Witch sequels.
Yeah, no Minority Report sequel, but they did make a TV show.
Did they? I did not know
Did
that.
not do very well.
No.
Nor was it reportedly very good.
Yeah, that would be the explanation for why I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it's one of these shows that just aired for like one season in some American channel and then got pretty quickly cancelled, I think. Everyone likes to bang on about how good American TV is, but we just keep forgetting that we just don't get the piles of shit.
Yeah, there's a quality filter that is imposed by the Atlantic. A film I absolutely loved from 1999 that could be due a sequel would be Three Kings. Although, to be honest, if you were going to do another Three Kings film, it's probably better just to be a remake. Just like, update it to the current iteration of the endless Middle Eastern conflicts that we're bogged down in as a civilization. So what Three Kings did for the first Iraq war, you could do again for, our modern conflicts in Syria and Yemen. Well, although, again, like I say, probably better if you just remade it and tried not to sort of link it up to the plot of the original film.
I mean, obviously, no one's really asking about whether we could get more franchisee superhero stuff, but after the last couple of Batman films, surely at some point we have to change our mind at whether we need more Nolan Dark Knight films. I thought I was sick of them after The Dark Knight Rises, but actually, retrospectively, I'd probably rather they just shat out a couple more increasingly pointless Nolan Bale films than make the last couple of films.
I think what we've learned from the last few Batman films since Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale stopped making them is that it wasn't that dark and gritty, semi-realistic Batman films are inherently good. It was that Nolan is a great director, Christian Bale is good at playing Batman, and they had a good team around them making some good films. It's definitely not a format I think other people can repeat, or at least not easily repeat. So if you want decent, dark and gritty Batman films, then you're probably going to need to get some combination of Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale and that team back together.
What I would actually like to see, and I'm aware that we are somewhat deviating by talking about superheroes yet again, but I would actually quite like to see someone get some money together and make a non-grim and gritty, not punishingly miserable big screen version of Batman, just to see how they'd approach it. You want it to not look like the Adam West stuff from the 60s. You want it to not look like the Joel Schumacher stuff.
Yeah.
It must be somehow possible.
But also, if you're going to go away from the Christopher Nolan look, because the Christopher Nolan look was kind of refreshing, because after the stupidity that was Batman and Robin, he did seem to have a fresh take on the character.
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm sure it must be possible to make a sort of bouncy gothic adventure version of Batman without it being grounded in brooding and punishing miserablism. Maybe.
Yeah.
I would just like to see someone take a pile of money and do that, but they clearly never will bet that much money on my hopes. Even if they are finally realising that not every superhero has to be grim and miserable, I think they're pretty sure that Batman does.
Yeah, well, inevitably there will be a Batman. I can't believe they're not going to try to do some form of Batman again at some point in the near future, because he does remain consistently popular despite the best efforts of filmmakers to make him unpopular.
Maybe they are finally doing what they should probably have done after the Nolan films and given the poor bastard a substantial rest. Maybe they'll actually, leave it out with the Batman films for a few years. Who knows?
Yeah.
Just for sheer inability to come up with what to do.
But the thing is, bringing it back to superheroes is interesting because, again, looking at the list of films from the 2000s, you get to the point when, that it is just completely dominated by superheroes. The domination of superheroes kind of starts in the early 2000s and just rises and rises. So a lot of the big films looking through are superhero films that there are sequels to. Like, the early 2000s, you get things like, the Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, in which you could argue that, there's some continuation with the current wave of Spider-Man. Like, Spider-Man is still a going concern. And as a cinema property that begins in, the 2000s, it's hard to find a list of things that want sequels to, because you can't be like, more Spider-Man? Well, we're getting more Spider-Man,
Oh, About a Boy. I liked that. But I'm probably happy if they didn't make a sequel.
Yeah, again, I think adding that to the list, like American Beauty, that I don't really see how you could do a sequel to that.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. As the 21st century rumbles on, possibly due to increasing Hollywood conservatism, the number of things you could do a sequel to that haven't had a sequel done to them gets pretty small.
Exactly, yeah. So it's an interesting exercise in trying to find something that's valid. I mean, like, Unbreakable might have actually been generally one of the candidates before, everything we've just said. It would have been one of the stronger candidates, I'd say.
Well, yeah. Especially because you always got the feeling they sort of wanted to do a sequel and they just didn't, because M. Night Shyamalan's career went a bit off the boil and he had trouble getting it off the ground, or someone lost interest somewhere, who knows. But anyway, yeah, long story short, don't worry everybody, most of the good sequels have been made.
Yeah, it's surprisingly difficult to answer this question.
But we got a few minutes out of it anyway.
I still reckon there's something in election, the Trump era. That's good. I'm going to email Matthew Broderick.
I'm just going to keep waiting for the Avatar sequel, which will finally persuade me that there are actually characters in that story. I know there aren't, but still. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard on this podcast, you can go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, which was broken for about 2 days, but now hopefully isn't again. We'd like to thank WordPress for breaking their software. And you can find all our past episodes, plus some articles we've written and such. And you can also leave a review for us on iTunes, which will help other people find the podcast, increase our listing statistics, and generally make us very happy. Please do. Thank you.
You can also find us on social media. On Twitter, we are at MFV Podcast. And on Facebook, you can just search for Moderate Fantasy Violence and you'll find us there. Please do follow us because we use statistics to evaluate how worthy our lives are.
It's true.
Including podcast downloads as well.
So thanks for downloading it already, really.
Yes, we love you. Now go make other people download it so we'll love you more. I've been Alistair Ball. You can find me on Twitter at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
Yes, and I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter at NickMB. You can find me on the internet at nickbryan.com. And if you're listening to this exactly as it comes out on Thursday, the last day of January, you can also find me at the Cheltenham True Believers Comics Festival convention event thing on Saturday, February the 2nd, where I will have a table and be selling my comics, including Little Deaths of Watson Tower, which I've mentioned on here before, and the new comic Moonframe, with art by Lucas Peverell and letters by DC Hopkins, about some astronauts who go to space and get stuck in a mysterious wall of brains. I'm going to have to work on my elevator pitch before I go to this convention, but it is a fun sort of sci-fi horror story, and give it a go. As I say, you can come to Cheltenham and buy it from me on Saturday the 2nd, or it'll be on sale on the internet from that day onwards also. And speaking of unnecessary sequels, you can also listen to the next episode of this podcast in 2 weeks' time, when we'll be covering the second season of The Punisher. Probably the penultimate ever Marvel Netflix show, unless the general corporate trajectory really changes. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. It is Matthew Broderick in Election, right?
Do you think I've seen Election?
It's good. I'm just checking so I don't have to do some horrible... Yes, it is. Excellent.
Thank God.